And Fleetwood is our treasurer, so if you're just visiting us today, please make sure you see Fleetwood before you leave. But we'd like to share with you and open up for dialogue what one of the temperates wrote after reading the conclusion of Rapture and Despair, Creativity, and the Bipolar Affect. Here's what one of the temperates wrote. Although my exposure to depression and mental illness is not completely foreign, I found myself ill-equipped, lacking knowledge and proper tools to comment on this last section of Karen's book. Nevertheless, I was moved to jot down some things as I read. Abandonment seems to be a common thread in the early years of the four musicians, Schumann, Mingus, Tchaikovsky, and Elgar. The ghost of loneliness revisiting each life throughout their adult years was evident. I thought that when one internalizes abandonment and then processes it as a justified act, then subsequent relationships in adulthood would suffer, because the one who was abandoned would search out a partner who had the inclination to abandon, or the abandoned would have learned themselves to abandon. This is what one has learned from a primal source. Perhaps the excitement of searching for and finding a partner would ultimately turn bitter-sweet, because their partner would eventually leave. On the flip side, if the abandoned one meets someone who does not leave, that loyalty is not intuitively trusted, thereby contributing confusion to someone who believes that he is not good enough to keep. Resolving and reconciling the abandonment issue is paramount for moving beyond and ahead. However, a young child can only process abandonment for what it is, a frightening and stressful situation. Emotional and physical detachment might desensitize and also might oversensitize a person who experienced such a break. Desensitize because that person would want to protect himself from further hurt and trauma. And oversensitize because that person can read others with a sixth sense and intuit emotions and sensations in other persons, sometimes positive and sometimes negative. Opening up the blocked artery as well as channeling sensitivity into beneficial activities is the key to unlocking whatever it is that needs attention and expression. Schumann, Mingus, Tchaikovsky, and Elgar were struggling in their world, and they suffered greatly emotionally. But I think each one of them found some precious jewel. Dr. Guzder, would you respond to what you've just heard about abandonment?
I thought that was a very sensitive, I don't know who wrote it, but it was a very sensitive comment, because your book actually talks about this. And I mean, I could say a lot of things.
Please do, please do.
First of all, we're talking about a baby who's abandoned at such a young age, as many of these people were. They had terrible traumas before the age of 4, when the self really graduates into a self. So before the age of 4, there was already something going on that was, I would say, felt and unthought. The felt unthought is part of the channeling of what has to be expressed later and understood later, much later.
You mean not verbalized by unthought? You mean not verbalized?
Not verbalized and also not thought about. That is, you have no reflective function.
I see.
So you have no reflective function.
Right.
So what you have is a feeling function.
Okay.
And for a baby that is, the word genius was used, a very sensitive baby is so attuned to the other and the one that is lost that even there was a kind of something about Mingus feeling that there was the chill of death, I think, was one of the subjects of it's almost like saying there was an object that was alive and then there was death. Okay, so it's a catastrophe. It's like you can't even think about how terrible it must be for an infant that living object will never come back. That is and there's a scene in your book where the Schumann cries at the window in this terrible way, and they find him in the morning because he's longing for that lost object. So we don't know a lot about what, even if these people had some vulnerability genetically to depressive illness, because we know that there's a genetic loading.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
In fact, we don't know a lot about how the brain actually survives such traumas and organizes them. And also we know that if you're a musician, for example, or a painter, or somebody who's involved in the neurosensory world, a baby sees our face, can read, a newborn infant can read 9 facial expressions and distinguish them and imitate them. So we are already hardwired for the visual world, and we are also hardwired for the hearing world. And those primal experiences are organized in our left brain, our right brain, not in our left brain. When we have left brain activity, that's where the verbal world starts. So usually in our civilization, when we're forced to go to school and articulate things, we lose a lot of the access to the right brain. But artists have a channel to interconnect these two parts of the brain in a much more fluid and plastic way. So they have access throughout their life, and there's evidence from looking at the brain that they do have this fluidity, right? So the survival of something that is catastrophic, so Winnicott would say you've had a breakdown long ago, but you weren't allowed to have that breakdown, because if you had that breakdown, then you would die. That is, if a baby had that breakdown and it was actualized as a breakdown, it would be called an anaclitic depression. That is, it's a depression before you even have an object to lose, because you actually have an object fully at age 4. So even before you can comprehend losing an object, these babies had to survive it. So they have to create some way to survive it. And so we know that babies who survive depressed mothers or dying mothers or death, that those issues are so deeply catastrophic that they're suppressed.
Yeah.
And it's only when we're very strong later in life that we could even access them, right? Or they can be accessed in very complex ways as life goes on. So that's one issue that is really, who knows? But there's a lot of misunderstanding about bipolar disorder in itself. I mean, because people are always diagnosing mania and bipolar disorder when in fact that's not what it is. It's childhood trauma, which you talked about with Alice Miller. It may be a misdiagnosed schizophrenia, which is actually about our affect regulation and those things and so on. So actually, there are very few children who ever have manic episodes, but many children have explosive episodes or rage or distress, terrible distress, which comes out of these traumas.
And this is being misdiagnosed because there's such a rise of diagnosis among youngsters.
I mean, it's a huge, that we have now, because you asked about medication, we have a real rise of using neuroleptic medications on children as a chemical restraint, because people are not providing them with a therapeutic place to deal with these breakdowns. So I guess what someone like Winnicott would say is that if you had such a catastrophic event in your life, you can't afford to have that breakdown, you would die of it. That is, you would stop eating, you would lose your desire to live, because you would be identified with the death side of the abandonment experience. And so you would create a false self, that is a self with which you could survive. And when you found a safe place, which might be finding an object, a relationship later in your life, which could withstand your biting and paranoia and your grief, and who actually stood by you and wasn't destroyed by it, that you had enough love and security that you can have your breakdown later. Or could it be that also the creative space gives you other options through your right brain to reprocess those unfelt? It's a channel. So if you look at the kind of titles that some of the musical pieces had, they're verbal titles, but they have very resonant.
They nail it, huh? They just nail it.
The Chill of Death, for example, for me was the most stunning. You know, because it was so close to many things that we were talking about. So that certainly would be part of it, and I guess we know even that children, even autistic children, who are very creative, before they have words, when they have words and the left brain develops, they can actually lose those creative channels. So people who are brilliantly musical or brilliantly able to draw, when you teach them to learn to speak, which is fundamental to their surviving in the real world, because it's we don't want them to live in a fantasy world either. Then it costs something. So everything in the psychic world in progression costs something. It costs something to be able to cross over and go back to the left brain. It costs something to go forward, to go into the right brain. And there was that brilliant book lately by the neuroanatomist and neurobiologist who had a stroke. I can't remember her name. Several of you seen her TED Talk. Brilliant, absolutely brilliant. And that TED Talk, which you may have seen,
amazing.
She talks and she talks about that euphoric experience that she had because she lost her left brain during the stroke, and she had to regain it. And as she regained it, she lost access to that place. Now, so is that place accessible to your musicians, these geniuses? Is it a reparation place? Is it a breakdown that had to be sealed off? Is a very complex question. So I can't comment on that part of it, but I think that's really important. And the fact that there's a mirror in the cultural space, that is the outside world, also provides us with so many breakdowns. Right? I mean, you know, being black in America, having mixed race children, having your teacher call you what, a yellow nigger, whatever it was, a yellow nigger, I think it was. All of these catastrophes also fueled traumas that were probably just as resonant as the interpersonal ones, right? The woman Mingus marries a woman who's normal. She wants to raise children and have a stable family, and he loves her too. But as soon as it's not a dyad and he doesn't have her undivided attention and the babies come, he can't stand these women anymore because he has to be the baby. He is the one who's the injured party, and he is the infant that has been disturbed and mutilated, and she goes and looks after this real baby, and he can't stand it, and probably doesn't know where his rage is coming from,
I don't think he did at all.
or his breakdown is coming from. I don't think he did at all. And that's the not conscious piece, that's right? Which is what the therapeutic, that was an opportunity for a therapeutic experience which didn't have any insight, and so then it gets driven into such a painful place that people become alcoholic or drug addicts, or they do impulsive and terrible things, and they don't even know where it's coming from. So that would be part of my comment on